He didn't come home that night. Not for their third anniversary. Not when she had cooked the jollof rice he pretended not to like, but always finished. Not when she sat at the table until the candles burned themselves down to nothing, and the food went cold, and the city outside kept moving like nothing had ended. Park Sung-ho knew exactly where Kang Min-jae was that night. He had made sure of it. He had rerouted the calendar reminder, buried the reservation confirmation under a stack of financial reports he knew Min-jae would never read until morning. And when Amara called, twice, then a third time, Sung-ho watched the phone screen light up on Min-jae's desk from the doorway, said nothing, and quietly pulled the office door closed. He stood in the hallway and smiled at the wall. If you have ever loved someone and felt yourself slowly disappearing inside that love, if you have ever wondered whether you were asking for too much just by existing in someone else's life, then this story is going to hurt you in a way that feels familiar. And maybe that is exactly why you need to hear it. Before we go further, if this is your first time on this channel, please subscribe and follow along until the very end. Stories like this one do not come around twice. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go to where it all began to break. Amara Brooks had learned, somewhere around the 14-month mark of their marriage, that silence in a penthouse could be louder than anything she had ever heard in her life. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in architectural design from Georgia Tech. She had left Atlanta, left her mother's cooking, left her book club, and her best friend Danny's loud laugh and the particular way the Georgia sun felt on her face in October. She had left all of it because she had believed in Kang Min-jae with the kind of certainty that most people reserve for things they can see and touch and hold. She had met him in New York at a design conference where she was presenting a mixed-use housing project, and he was, apparently, evaluating real estate investments. He had approached her after the panel with a question so specific and intelligent about load-bearing aesthetics that she had assumed he was an architect. He wasn't. He had simply read her published paper on the subject, all 42 pages of it. That was the thing about Min-jae that nobody warned her about. Not his money, not his position, not the strange, carefully controlled way men moved around him in rooms. It was the way he paid attention, fully, completely. Like you were the only problem in the world worth solving. She had fallen in love with a man who listened. She had married, it turned out, a man who had stopped. By the time their third anniversary came and went, burned down to wax and silence and uneaten food, Amara had been working as a freelance architectural consultant in Seoul for 2 years, operating mostly out of a studio space she had converted herself in Mapogu, taking on Korean residential clients, who sometimes seemed surprised when she walked through the door. She had learned enough Korean to hold a professional conversation and enough about the city's building codes to be taken seriously. She had built something here. She had tried. She just hadn't managed to build anything that resembled a marriage. The night she made her decision, it was raining. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain that announces itself. Just the flat, persistent Seoul rain in late October that soaks through everything if you stand in it long enough and makes the streets smell like wet concrete and exhaust. Amara stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse. Min-jae's penthouse. She always thought of it as his, even after 3 years, and watched the Han River go dark under the rain. She had her phone in her hand. She had been holding it for 40 minutes. She was not waiting for Min-jae to call. She had stopped expecting that somewhere around month 8. She was waiting, she realized, for herself to make a decision she had been avoiding for almost a year. The divorce papers were in her bag. She had picked them up from the attorney's office 3 days ago and had been carrying them around like they were something that might detonate if she handled them wrong. They were printed on ordinary paper. They did not feel ordinary. Kang Min-jae came home at 11:47. She knew because she heard the elevator, and she had stopped pretending she didn't track the sound of it. He walked in, looking the way he always looked after a long day. Jacket still perfectly aligned, tie loosened exactly 1 inch. The particular exhaustion he carried not on his face, but somewhere behind his eyes where he thought nobody could see it. He was 41 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent 20 of those years deciding things and carrying the weight of those decisions alone. She had found that quality magnetic once. Now she just found it lonely. He saw her standing at the window and he said, "You're still up." Not a question, an observation. The kind of thing you say to someone you have lived with long enough that their presence no longer requires acknowledgement, only cataloging. I need to give you something, Amara said. She crossed the room. She did not let herself hesitate, because she had learned that hesitation was where her resolve went to die. She took the envelope from her bag and placed it on the dining table between them. The same table where the anniversary dinner had sat untouched 3 days ago. She wasn't sure either of them had eaten at that table in 6 weeks. Minjae looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. "What is this?" he said. It was not a question either. "Divorce papers," she said. "I need you to look them over and sign where I've marked." The silence that followed was different from the usual silence of the apartment. This one had texture. It had weight. She watched something move through his face that she could not quite name. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man who has been driving toward a cliff for months and has just realized the cliff was closer than he calculated. "Amara." "Don't," she said quietly. "Please don't say my name like that right now." "Like what?" "Like it means something. Like this is going to become a conversation where you explain to me why I'm wrong about what I'm feeling." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled out a chair and sat down, not to eat, just to have something to do with his body. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. "I haven't been ignoring you," he said. She almost laughed. Not a cruel laugh, just the helpless kind that comes when someone says something so exactly wrong that it loops back around to being almost impressive. "Minjae, our anniversary was 3 days ago. You didn't come home. I had a situation with the Daejeon operation. I know. You always have a situation." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this. Not the words exactly, but the steadiness. She had sat in her studio 3 days ago and decided she would not cry. Not because she didn't have anything to cry about, because she had already done all of it. "I'm not angry anymore. That's the part I need you to understand. I was angry for a long time. Now I'm just done." He looked up at her then, and for a second, just a second, she saw the man she had married. The one who had read her 42-page paper, the one who had flown to Atlanta to meet her mother without being asked, the one who had once pulled the car over on the Gangbyeon-Bukro Expressway at 2 in the morning because she had mentioned, offhand, that she had never seen Seoul from the bridge walkway at night, and he had simply stopped the car and walked with her out there in the cold for 40 minutes, not saying much, just present. That man was still in there somewhere. She believed that. She just couldn't wait for him to find his way back out anymore. "You can have the attorneys contact mine," she said. "I'm not looking to fight over anything. I just want—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I want my life back." She picked up her bag. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. Minjae didn't move from his chair. The elevator came. She stepped inside. The doors closed on him, sitting at that table in the expensive silence of the apartment he had bought to impress a city that already feared him, staring at a sealed envelope like it had said something he wasn't equipped to answer. He sat there for a long time after she was gone. Then he opened the envelope. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a clean grief. Minjae did not fall apart in any visible way because Kong Minjae did not fall apart. That was simply not a mechanism he possessed, or if he had ever possessed it, he had burned it out of himself somewhere in his 20s when falling apart could get you killed. What he did instead was work. He worked with the kind of intensity that his lieutenants recognized as dangerous. He restructured 2 divisions, renegotiated a port contract that had been stalled for 8 months, and personally oversaw a debt collection operation in Incheon that should have been handled 3 levels below him. Park Seung-ho observed all of this from his usual position, slightly behind, slightly to the left, always within earshot. Seung-ho was 38 years old. He had been with the Baeko Syndicate for 14 years, the last 6 of which he had spent as Minjae's most trusted lieutenant. He was not physically imposing. Medium height, thinning hair, he kept cut close to compensate, the kind of forgettable face that turned out to be a professional asset. People underestimated him constantly. He had built an entire career on that underestimation. He stood in the doorway of Minjae's office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Amara had left, and watched his boss read through a financial report without registering any of it. Minjae's eyes were moving, but nothing was landing. He had the look of a man trying to read in a burning room. "Boss," Seung-ho said, "the Jeju contact is confirmed for Friday." "Reschedule it," Minjae said. "We've rescheduled twice already. Kim won't—" Reschedule it. Not louder, just final. Sung-ho nodded. He did not reschedule it. He had learned years ago that there was often more value in letting things be rescheduled and then quietly resolving them himself. It created dependency. It created the impression of indispensability. He was very good at creating impressions. He retreated to his own office and sat down and thought, as he had been thinking for 11 days, about the divorce papers. This had not been his plan. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, the way he was occasionally clear with himself in private about the things he had done. The divorce had not been his intention. His intention had been management, control. Min-jae distracted enough by marital friction that he wouldn't scrutinize the accounts too carefully. Amara isolated enough by rumor and intercepted communication that she wouldn't push back too hard or build alliances within the organization. It had been, he thought, elegant. What he had not accounted for was the woman's threshold. He had underestimated her. That was the honest answer. He had looked at Amara Brooks, foreign, female, operating in a world that was not built for her in any language, and he had assumed a certain softness. He had intercepted the anniversary reservation confirmation and figured she would interpret Min-jae's absence as business as usual. He had rerouted the birthday message Min-jae had dictated to his assistant and figured she would chalk it up to distraction. He had spread careful, calibrated rumors through the lower ranks about the foreign wife being a liability, a vulnerability, and figured word would get back to her in the diluted, deniable way that rumors do, and she would retreat further, become smaller, maybe eventually go back to America on her own. Instead, she had walked into the penthouse on a rainy October evening and put divorce papers on the table without raising her voice. Sung-ho opened his desk drawer and looked at the ledger he kept in paper, not digital. Old habit. Digital records were too easy to subpoena. Across 3 columns, in his precise, small handwriting, was the accounting of what he had moved. 80 million won here, 43 million there. Construction front companies that existed for 11 months and then dissolved. Wire transfers routed through Macau and back through a shell in Singapore. The numbers added up to something that, if Min-jae ever focused long enough to follow the thread, would end Seung-ho's life before he made it to a courtroom. He needed Min-jae not focused. He needed Min-jae to still be thinking about Amara. And for the first time since she had left, Seung-ho realized he needed to give Min-jae a reason to keep thinking about her. He picked up his personal phone and made a call. The call was to a man named Cho, who was not employed by the syndicate officially, but who appeared on their books as a waste management consultant. Cho had a talent for moving information, specifically for moving it to places where it would be found by the people you wanted to find it. "I need something delivered," Seung-ho said, anonymously, to a woman. "What kind of something?" "Evidence," Seung-ho said, "the kind that tells a story, specifically the story that her husband chose to stop loving her on purpose." There was a pause on the line. "That's specific," Cho said. "It needs to be convincing, canceled reservations, call logs showing diverted calls, a letter, maybe, something personal looking." "Personal looking costs more." "I know what it costs," Seung-ho said. "Do it." He hung up and looked at the ledger again. If Amara believed Min-jae had been deliberately cruel, not just neglectful, but actively, intentionally indifferent, she would not come back. And if she would not come back, Min-jae would keep carrying this, keep burning his focus on a wound that Seung-ho had very carefully made sure would not heal cleanly. It was not a kind plan. He knew that. He had stopped needing to be kind to people a long time ago. Kindness was expensive, and he was already overdrawn on things he could afford. Amara, meanwhile, had found an apartment. It was small. That was the first thing she registered when she walked through the door with 2 bags and a box of drafting supplies. Small, and on the 4th floor of a building in Mapogu that had a view of the Han River if you stood at the kitchen window and leaned slightly to the left. The landlord had looked at her with the particular expression she had gotten used to in Seoul. Not unfriendly exactly, just recalibrating. The foreign woman. The woman alone. He had asked, twice, if her husband would also be viewing the apartment. "No," she had said both times. The second time she had said it without flinching. She put her bags down and sat on the floor. No furniture yet, and looked at the walls. They were the standard off-white of every rental apartment in every city in the world. She had redesigned load-bearing walls in 3-story commercial buildings. She had specified exact finish grades for cast concrete in a museum lobby in Itaewon. She was sitting on the floor of a bare apartment and the walls felt enormous. She took out her phone. She almost called Danny. Then she calculated the time difference. Atlanta was 14 hours behind, and put the phone down. She sat with the quiet for a while. She had promised herself she would not revisit the marriage in the apartment, that she would keep it as a clean space, a new space, the way you try to keep a wound clean so it heals without infection. But sitting on that floor, she found herself thinking about the bridge. The night he had pulled the car over. How he had walked beside her for 40 minutes in the cold without needing to fill the silence with anything. How that had felt, at the time, like the safest she had ever been with another person. She thought, where did that man go? And then the envelope arrived. It came 4 days after she moved in, slipped under her apartment door in a plain manila sleeve with no return address. Inside was a printed document, 6 pages, that she initially took for some kind of legal notice. She sat at the kitchen counter and began reading and then stopped. It was not a legal notice. It was a log. Dates, times, actions. A table of canceled reservations, restaurants, a weekend trip to Jeju they had planned for their second anniversary and then hadn't taken, a gallery opening she had mentioned 3 times. Next to each entry was a notation in Korean that she read slowly, word by word. The notations all said variations of the same thing, canceled per KM's instruction, per his instruction. There was also a call log, 17 dates over 2 years. Her phone number. The notation beside each one, call received, redirected per KM standing order. The last page was a letter, handwritten or designed to look it. In Korean, she translated it with her phone, slowly, sentence by sentence. It read like a memo from one of Min Jae's operations managers to Seung-ho, confirming that personal communications from the subject had been redirected as instructed, and that the isolation protocol was proceeding on schedule. Isolation protocol. She sat with the translated words in front of her for a long time. She had thought he was absent. She had thought he was careless and consumed and emotionally unavailable in the particular way that powerful men sometimes were. Not malicious, just unable to prioritize anything that didn't produce a result he could quantify. This was different. This was deliberate. This was a man who had decided she was a problem to be managed and had delegated her removal from his life to his staff. She stood up from the counter. She walked to the window. She leaned left and looked at the Han River and let herself feel the full weight of what was in her hands. It felt like the difference between falling and being pushed. She had spent a year and a half questioning herself, wondering if she was too demanding, too sensitive to absence, given that she had signed up, in some sense, for a life with a man who operated in a world that didn't pause for anniversaries. She had had conversations with herself at 3 in the morning in the penthouse about whether her expectations were reasonable, whether she was being fair, whether love was supposed to look like this, or if she had simply misremembered what it felt like to be chosen. And all of that time there had been a standing order. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She would have expected them to shake. Instead, there was just the cold, clarifying certainty of a woman who has spent too long doubting herself and has finally been handed a reason to stop. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. "The process," she said when the call connected. "Let's move it forward." The rain started again outside. She watched it hit the river and barely make a mark. Across the city, in a corner booth of a bar in Gangnam that he had owned for 11 years and visited maybe 4 times, Kang Min-jae sat across from a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched and thought about a woman leaning slightly left at a kitchen window to see the river. He didn't know she was doing that. He didn't know about the apartment, or the window, or the river view that required a lean. He was imagining her back in the penthouse. He kept doing that, kept placing her there in his mind because the alternative was understanding that she was somewhere he didn't know, in a city he controlled, having a life he couldn't access. He had signed the papers. Not quickly, not without sitting with them for 6 days. But he had signed them because she had asked him to, and because somewhere in the part of himself he had spent 2 decades suppressing, he understood that she had not asked for the wrong reasons. His phone buzzed. Seung-ho. He looked at the screen for a moment, then picked up. "The Jeju contact finally confirmed for next Tuesday," Seung-ho said. "I was able to smooth it over." "Good," Min-jae said. "There's also a situation with the Incheon books I need to walk you through. Some discrepancies." "Tomorrow," Min-jae said. "Of course." A pause. You doing all right, boss? Minjay looked at the untouched whiskey. Handle the Inchin thing before tomorrow, he said. I want the full ledger on my desk by morning. He hung up. He did not know why he had said that. He had not planned to say it. Something, some old, careful instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of organized crime, had moved his mouth without consulting his mind. He sat in the bar for another hour. He thought about Amara walking out of the elevator in the lobby, turning left toward the street, disappearing into the rain. He thought about the ledger. He would not be able to say later what connected those two thoughts. Some pattern recognition below the level of conscious reasoning. Some accumulation of small wrongnesses he had been too distracted to catalog. He picked up his phone and called a different number. Not Seung-ho. A man named Yoon Tae-hyun, who was technically a private investigator, but operated in the space between official and otherwise, the way many useful people did in Minjay's world. I need you to look at something for me, Minjay said. What kind of something? Yoon said. Minjay was quiet for a moment. Start with the last 3 years, he said. Everything that touched my personal life. I want to know what I missed. Yoon Tae-hyun worked out of an office in Yeongdeungpo that smelled like instant coffee and old paper, on the 3rd floor of a building that had not been renovated since the early 90s and showed no signs of ambition in that direction. He was 52 years old, formerly with the National Police Agency's Financial Crimes Unit, and he had left that position under circumstances that were never fully explained and never fully needed to be. He was good at finding things. He was better at finding things people had specifically tried to hide. He called Minjay back on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the bar conversation. I need to meet, Yoon said, no preamble. That was one of the things Minjay had always appreciated about him. My office. Not your office. Office, Yoon said. Somewhere you don't have staff. Minjay was quiet for a moment. The coffee place in Hapjeong. Noon. Make it one. I need the extra hour. He hung up before Minjay could respond. Minjay sat with the dead, call for a moment, then set his phone face down on the desk. Across the room, through the glass partition that separated his inner office from the operations floor, he could see Seung-ho at his standing desk typing something, not looking up. There was nothing unusual about Seung-ho not looking up. There was nothing unusual about any specific thing Seung-ho did. That was the whole problem with what Minjay was beginning to feel. It was not a fact yet. It was a texture, a shift in the air pressure of a room he thought he knew perfectly. He watched Seung-ho type for a moment longer than necessary. Then he pulled up the Inchin ledger on his own terminal and began reading from the top. The coffee place in Hapjeong was the kind of small, serious establishment that served 4 kinds of pour-over and nothing that came in a paper cup with a plastic lid. Minjay arrived at 12:58 and ordered without looking at the menu because there were only 4 things on it. Yoon arrived at 1:03, slightly damp from the drizzle outside, carrying a canvas bag that looked unremarkable and contained, Minjay would discover, approximately 3 years of someone's professional life compressed into printed documents and a USB drive. Yoon sat down across from him and did not take off his jacket. Before I show you anything, Yoon said, I need to know if you want the version that's organized or the version that's honest. They're different? The organized version has context and sequencing. The honest version starts with the conclusion and works backward. He looked at Minjay steadily. Given who you are and what I found, I'd recommend starting with the conclusion. Minjay wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Then start there. Yoon reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the table between them and turned it so Minjay could read it. It was a timeline. 31 entries spanning 3 years and 2 months. Dates on the left, events on the right. Minjay read the first 4 entries and went very still. He read the way he did everything, completely, without visible reaction, his face held in the particular neutrality he had trained himself into over 20 years. But his hands tightened around the cup. Yoon, who had interviewed enough people to read the body when the face was unavailable, noticed and said nothing. The timeline documented, in order, a diverted calendar reminder for a reservation at a restaurant in Insadong, their first anniversary. A redirected phone call from Amara's number on a Tuesday in March 2 years ago that had been routed to a voicemail box that was never checked. A canceled airline booking for Jeju that had been reversed within an hour of being made, the reversal logged under Minjay's own employee credentials. A message, drafted on Minjay's personal account, and sent, then recalled within minutes and replaced with silence. That had said, in its original form, something about missing her. Min-jae's eyes stopped on that entry. "The message," he said. His voice was even. "Controlled in the way a dam is controlled. It holds because it was built to hold, not because there is no pressure behind it. Who recalled it?" "The access log shows your credentials," Yoon said. "But the timestamp puts it at 11:41 p.m. on a night your own security footage shows you were in a car on the way back from Incheon. You couldn't have been at a terminal." Min-jae looked up from the paper. "Someone had my credentials," he said. "Someone has had your credentials for a long time," Yoon said. "Or more accurately, someone had access to your accounts without needing your credentials because they administered the systems that your credentials ran on." The coffee place was quiet. A barista ground something in the back. Somewhere a phone buzzed once and was silenced. "Show me the rest," Min-jae said. Yoon showed him the rest. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it the coffee was cold, and Min-jae had not moved except to turn pages. What emerged from those pages was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was meticulous. It was the work of someone who understood that the most effective damage is not done all at once. It is done in small, deniable increments that the victim attributes to bad luck, and the perpetrator can always explain away. The reservation cancellations. The rerouted calls. 17 of them, as the document Amar had received had accurately noted, though she had no way of knowing where that document came from or who had sent it to her and why. The rumor cultivation. Yoon had traced it through 3 junior members of the syndicate who had each, in separate interviews, used identical phrasing to describe the foreign wife as a concern and a liability to operational security, phrasing that had originated nowhere naturally and had been introduced by a single source. And then the financial layer, which was, Yoon explained quietly, the actual point of all of it. "Whoever did this needed you distracted," Yoon said. "The marriage wasn't the target. It was the mechanism. You distracted by personal grief, not asking the right questions, not looking at the accounts too hard." He slid another page across. This is what they were covering. Min-jae looked at the numbers. He had spent 20 years in organized crime. He was not a naive man about money or about the ways people stole it, but even by those standards, what he was looking at was substantial. Transfers disguised as operational expenses. Construction fronts that invoiced for work that had never been done on properties that did not exist. The total across 3 years, Yoon had highlighted it at the bottom of the page in red, the only color on the entire document, was 460 million won, and some change that seemed almost insulting given the scale of the main figure. 460 million won. Min-jae set the page down. He looked at the window. The rain outside had picked up again. "You have a name," he said. Not a question. "I have evidence that points in one direction very consistently," Yoon said carefully. "Say the name." Yoon looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Park Seung-ho." The silence that followed was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a man who has just been told that the thing he feared might be true is true, and is now doing the internal reckoning that comes before any external action. Min-jae sat with it. He breathed steadily. He did not break anything. He did not raise his voice. He looked at the table and worked through it the way he worked through everything, systematically, starting with the thing he could not afford to get wrong. "How solid," he said finally. "The financial trail is solid enough to take to a prosecutor," Yoon said. "The personal interference, the marriage, the communications, that's circumstantial in places. Strong circumstantial. But a good defense attorney could create doubt." "I'm not taking it to a prosecutor," Min-jae said. Yoon nodded slowly. He had not expected otherwise. "Then what do you need from me?" "Everything you have, and I need you to keep looking." Min-jae looked up from the table. "Specifically at what he's planning next. A man who does this much doesn't stop when the wife leaves. He stops when he's out the door with the money or when someone stops him." Yoon picked up his canvas bag. "I'll need 2 more weeks." "You have one," Min-jae said. He stood up and left enough cash on the table to cover both coffees 3 times over. "And Yoon, nobody knows you're working this. Nobody." He walked out into the rain without an umbrella and didn't notice. The drive back to the syndicate's main offices took 22 minutes in midday traffic. Min-jae sat in the back of the car and did not look at his phone and did not speak to his driver and thought about 14 years. 14 years he had trusted Seong-ho, had brought him up through the organization, promoted him past men with more seniority because he had watched Seong-ho work and had seen something he recognized, a kind of cold, patient intelligence. He had valued it. He had mistaken its coldness for loyalty, when in fact its coldness was simply itself, applied to whoever was most useful to point it at. He thought about Amara. He thought about 17 phone calls routed to a voicemail that was never checked. He thought about what it must have felt like, sitting in the penthouse, calling, listening to it ring, and eventually stopping calling because she had decided she understood what the silence meant. She had understood something. She had just understood the wrong thing because the right thing had been hidden from her carefully by someone with both the access and the patience to do it correctly. He thought about the document she had received, the one Yoon had mentioned, the anonymous envelope with the call logs and the isolation protocol letter. Yoon had flagged it as suspicious, too clean, too perfectly calibrated to maximize damage, designed not to expose the truth but to confirm a lie, designed to make her believe Min-jae had been deliberately cruel rather than deliberately deceived alongside her. Seong-ho had sent it. Min-jae was certain of this the way he was certain of very few things that he couldn't yet prove. He had sent it to make sure she wouldn't come back, to close the door and cement it. The car pulled up to the office building. Min-jae sat for an extra moment. "Go park," he told his driver. "I'll call when I need you." He went inside. He nodded at two men in the lobby. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, walked past the operations room where 8 people were doing 8 things, and pushed open the door to his office without breaking stride. Seong-ho was already inside, standing at Min-jae's desk, reviewing something on his tablet. He looked up when Min-jae entered and said easily, with the comfort of a man in a space he had always been welcome, "The Busan contact confirmed for Friday, and the quarterly review? Sit down," Min-jae said. Seong-ho registered the tone. His face did a small thing, a micro-adjustment, a recalibration, and then settled back into its usual measured expression. He sat in the chair across the desk. Min-jae sat behind the desk. He looked at Seong-ho with the same face he brought to every meeting, neutral, attentive, giving nothing away. They were, in this moment, 2 men who had spent years reading each other across tables. "The Incheon accounts," Min-jae said. "I went through them this morning." "The discrepancies," Seong-ho said, nodding. "I was planning to walk you through that. It's a formatting issue with the reporting system. The numbers are accurate. The display is—" "The Daejeon accounts too," Min-jae said. A pause. Brief. Professional. "Daejeon is a different ledger," Seong-ho said. "I'd want to pull the documentation before we— and the Mapo construction fund." Something shifted in the room. Not visible exactly. Not something you could photograph. But it was there. A change in the air between them, like the moment before a door opens that you know will not open onto anything good. Seong-ho looked at him. For the first time in the conversation, he stopped speaking. "I'm going to need those 3 ledgers on my desk," Min-jae said. "Full records. Not the quarterly summaries, the raw transaction logs." "Of course," Seong-ho said. His voice was steady. "It'll take a day or two to—" "Today," Min-jae said. "I need them today." The pause this time was longer. "That's a significant pull," Seong-ho said. "I'd want to verify the records are complete before presenting—" "Seong-ho!" Min-jae said his name the way he said very few names, quietly, completely, in a register that landed in the chest before it reached the ears. "Today." Seong-ho stood up. He held his tablet against his chest like a shield he knew was inadequate. He looked at Min-jae for a moment with an expression that was almost, not quite, readable. "I'll have them sent up," he said. He left. Min-jae turned his chair to face the window. He looked at the city. He breathed. He counted 8 seconds between each breath, a habit from his 20s, from the years when controlling his breathing was sometimes the only thing standing between a situation and a catastrophe. Across the operations floor, invisible to Min-jae, Seong-ho walked to his own office at a pace that was slightly faster than usual. He closed the door. He sat at his desk. He opened the encrypted partition on his laptop and began, quickly and methodically, to assess what could still be moved and how fast. He had contingency plans. He had always had contingency plans. A man in his position, doing what he had been doing, operated in a permanent state of prepared exit. He had accounts in Macau and Singapore that were registered to identities that had no connection to Park Seung-ho. He had a passport and a name he had used twice, both times successfully. He had a contact at Incheon International who could move him through a private charter terminal without standard processing. What he had not planned for was Min Jae asking for raw transaction logs the same week he had reorganized 3 of the construction fronts. He had 2 days, he estimated. Maybe 3 if he manufactured a delay in the records pool. But Min Jae's request had carried a frequency he recognized. The low, specific frequency of a man who was not asking because he was curious. He was asking because he already knew something. The question was how much. Seung-ho opened his personal phone. He went to the contacts and found Cho's number. He stared at it for a moment. Then he put the phone down and thought instead. Panicking was the one thing he could not afford. Panicking produced decisions that could be traced. He had watched men panic under pressure, and he had watched those men make mistakes that cost them everything, and he had learned from that the way he had learned from everything, cold, observational, without sentiment. He needed to know what Min Jae actually had, and he needed to know it before Min Jae knew that he was trying to find out. He picked up his office phone and called down to the data management team. "The boss needs the Incheon and Daejeon logs compiled," he said, with perfect professional neutrality. "Full transaction records. Pull them for me by 5, I'll review before they go up." He hung up and sat back. Reviewing before they went up. That was the move. One last look at what was there before Min Jae saw it. Not to hide it, too late for that, probably, but to understand exactly what the picture looked like from the other side. In her apartment in Mapogu, Amara was on a call with her attorney. "The process is moving," the attorney said. "We should have final documentation ready for signature within the week. Once he countersigns, it's a straightforward filing." "Has he been in contact with your office?" His attorney reached out last week, confirmed he's not contesting. She processed that. Not contesting. She had expected something. Some last-minute negotiation, some attempt at delay. She had braced for it. His not contesting felt like a door closing that she had been standing in front of for so long she had forgotten there was a room on the other side. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." She ended the call and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. Through the window, angled left, she could see a gray strip of the Han River. The rain had flattened the surface of it. Everything moved under the rain. The traffic, the pedestrians, the construction cranes turning slowly in the wet wind. And the river just absorbed it all and kept going, which she found either comforting or terrible depending on what day it was. She had an appointment at 2 with a new client, a residential project in Yongsan, a couple wanting to reconfigure the interior of a traditional hanok into a working studio space. She had the preliminary plans open on her laptop. She had slept 4 hours. She had eaten half a piece of toast and then forgotten about the other half. She was doing, she thought, fine. In the way that people use fine to mean, I am still standing and still working and I have not lost anything critical, and I will not be thinking about whether any of this was real until it is late enough at night that there is nothing left to do but think. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Brooks." The voice was male, mid-range, the Korean accented but clear. "My name is not important right now. What I need to tell you is..." She stood up straighter. "Who is this?" "The document you received. The one with the call logs and the letter. You need to know it was not sent by someone trying to help you." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "It was sent to make you believe something specific, something that's not completely accurate." A pause. She could hear traffic in the background, someone outside moving. "Your husband didn't issue a standing order. He doesn't know those calls were redirected. He's finding that out right now the same way you found out, through evidence someone else assembled." The kitchen felt very small suddenly. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because the man who sent you that document is trying to make sure you and Kang Min Jae stay apart. And he has reasons for that have nothing to do with your marriage." Another pause. "I'm not asking you to go back to him. I'm asking you to understand what actually happened." The line went dead. Amara stood in her kitchen for a long time after the call ended. She looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the river through the window. She thought about the document, the precision of it, the way it had arrived exactly when she was most raw, most ready to have her worst fears confirmed. She thought about the way it had felt to read it, not like discovering a truth. She understood that now. like being handed a story that fit perfectly into the wound that was already there. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because she was weak, because her legs needed a moment to catch up with her head. She sat on the cold tile and held her phone against her chest and thought about 17 phone calls. 17 calls that she had stopped making because she had decided he didn't want to hear from her. And somewhere across the city, Kang Min-jae was looking at records that were telling him the same story from the other side. They had been lied to, both of them, carefully, patiently, over 3 years, by the same man. And they had each, separately, believed it, because the lies had been designed to fit exactly into the shape of their individual fears, and because no one had ever told them to look at the same set of facts at the same time from the same room. That night, Seung-ho sat in his car in the parking structure beneath the syndicate building and made the call he had been avoiding. "It's moving faster than I expected," he told Cho. "I need the exit timeline accelerated." "How fast?" 72 hours. Silence on the other end. "That's not a timeline," Cho said. "That's a panic. Can you do it or not?" "The Incheon charter contact needs 4 days minimum for the 48 hours, Seung-ho said. "Figure it out." He hung up. He sat in the dark of the parking structure and listened to the sound of his own breathing in the enclosed space. In, out, steady. He was still in control of this. He told himself that clearly, the way he told himself most things. Without sentiment, without decoration. He was still in control. What he did not know, what he could not know, because the man who knew it was careful not to let it show, was that Yoon Tae-hyun had been watching his car for the past 40 minutes from the level above, had photographed the call being made, and had already sent the image to a number that rang in a coffee-cold office where Kang Min-jae sat reading raw transaction logs with the particular focused attention of a man who had finally run out of reasons not to look. Min-jae looked at the logs. He looked at a number in the Mapo construction column that had no corresponding invoice, no vendor record, and no authorization signature. He picked up his pen and circled it. Then he picked up his phone and called Yoon. "I need everything you have on his exit planning," he said before Yoon could speak. "And I need it now." Yoon's file arrived at 2:17 in the morning. Min-jae had not gone home. He was still at his desk, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the raw transaction log spread across every surface that wasn't already occupied by something else. His assistant had stopped checking on him at midnight. The operations floor outside the glass partition was dark and empty. The building had the particular quality of a place that was built for 40 people and currently contained one, and was quietly registering the difference. His phone buzzed. Yoon's name. A file attachment and 3 words beneath it. All of it. Sorry. Min-jae opened the file. It took him 40 minutes to read through it the first time and 20 minutes the second time, moving more slowly, making sure he was not misreading anything, because the alternative, that he was reading it correctly, was something he needed to be certain of before he let himself respond to it. He was reading it correctly. Seung-ho had not been planning to run for 72 hours. He had been planning to run for 3 weeks. The 72-hour timeline was an acceleration, triggered by something. Yoon's file documented the exit infrastructure in detail, the charter contact at Incheon, the Macau accounts, 2 passports under 2 names with photographs that were clearly Seung-ho taken in different lighting and with different hair. A safe house in Busan used as a staging point. Suitcases, already packed, confirmed by a surveillance photograph taken through the window of Seung-ho's apartment in Mapo by someone Yoon had deployed without explaining what for. But the last section of the file was the one that made Min-jae set his phone down on the desk and sit back and look at the ceiling for a long moment. Seung-ho had made contact with federal authorities 6 days ago. Not to confess, not to negotiate, to deliver. He had provided a package of documents, operational records, location data, financial structures, to an agent in the Financial Intelligence Unit whose name appeared in Yoon's file with a note that said, "Confirmed meeting, duration 40 minutes, Seung-ho left without being detained," which means he gave them something they wanted. He had given them Min-jae. Not just the syndicate's financial operations, Min-jae personally. Yoon had a source inside the unit, unnamed in the file, but clearly reliable, given the specificity, who had confirmed that the package Seung-ho delivered included evidence connecting Min-jae directly to 4 operations that would, if prosecuted, carry sentences measured in decades. The evidence was fabricated. Min-jae knew this the same way he knew his own name. Not because he was innocent of all things, but because the specific 4 operations Seung-ho had named were ones Min-jae had not been part of in any operational sense, and the financial records linking him to them had been constructed from the same shell company infrastructure that Seung-ho had built and controlled. It was elegant, in the way that truly vicious things sometimes were. Seung-ho had stolen 460 million won using structures he had built in Min-jae's name. Now he was handing those structures to federal investigators as evidence against Min-jae. He would walk out of the country carrying the money, and Min-jae would spend the next several years in a courtroom trying to prove that the architecture of his own organization had been used against him by the man he had trusted most. And while Min-jae was doing that, Seung-ho would be sitting in an apartment in Macau watching the news. Min-jae picked up his phone. He called Yoon. Yoon picked up on the second ring, which meant he had not been asleep. "The federal contact," Min-jae said. "How long do I have before they move?" "My source says the unit is still in review. They need to verify the documents before they can get warrants." A pause. "Maybe 5 days, maybe 4. Seung-ho's exit timeline is 72 hours. "I know. He's going to be gone before they can arrest him and before they can question him about the fabrication." "I know," Yoon said again. There was something in his voice, not quite apology, but the adjacent thing. The sound of a man who has delivered bad news enough times to know that acknowledging it is the only honest response. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Seoul at 2:30 in the morning was still lit, still moving, still completely indifferent to the specific nature of what was happening on the 4th floor of this particular building. "I need him before he gets to Incheon," Min-jae said. "That's a narrow window." "Then I need to know the moment he moves." Min-jae stood up. "Watch his apartment. Watch the Busan route. If he heads for the charter terminal, I want to know before he clears the parking structure." "Understood." Yoon hesitated. "And the woman? Amara?" Min-jae stopped moving. "What about her?" "Seung-ho's contingency," Yoon said carefully. "It's in the last appendix. I flagged it. Page 31. Min-jae went back to the phone and opened the file. Page 31. He found the section Yoon had flagged and read it, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees, though nothing had changed. Seung-ho had identified Amara as a potential liability to his exit. Specifically, if Min-jae connected the dots quickly enough to move against Seung-ho before the federal warrants came through, Seung-ho's contingency was to use Amara as leverage. She was accessible, living alone in a new apartment without the protection she had had in the penthouse. She was, in Seung-ho's documented calculation, the one variable that could slow Min-jae down enough to buy the hours needed for the Incheon exit. She was a contingency target. Min-jae closed the file. "Get someone to her building," he said. His voice was the same, controlled even, carrying no more weight in any particular syllable than any other. "Discreet. Nobody she sees, nobody who talks to her. They watch the building and they call me the second anything moves near her." "Already done," Yoon said. "Sent 2 people an hour ago when I saw the appendix." Min-jae was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He hung up. He stood in his empty office at 2:40 in the morning and pressed both hands flat on the surface of his desk and breathed. In, 8 seconds. Out, 8 seconds. The thing about training yourself to breathe correctly under pressure is that the breathing works even when nothing else does. The breathing was working. The rest of him was something he would have to account for later, in whatever quiet was available after this was over. I thought about Amara alone in an apartment she had chosen because it had a view of the river, if you leaned left. He thought about Seung-ho writing her name in a contingency column. He picked up his jacket and walked out. Seung-ho did not sleep that night either. He sat in his apartment. The suitcases were in the closet, already packed, had been, for 11 days, and worked through his timeline with the same methodical attention he applied to everything. The charter contact had pushed back on 48 hours, and they had negotiated to 60, which meant Thursday morning, early, before the city was properly awake. He had enough time. He had calculated it 3 times, and it held. What he was less certain about was Min-jae. The request for raw transaction logs had been a signal. He had understood it immediately. What he did not know was how far Min-jae had gotten, and whether he had gotten there through the ledgers alone or through something outside the organization. An outside source would be worse. An outside source meant the information had not been filtered through Seong-ho's administrative access, which meant he couldn't assess what it contained or how it was framed. He thought about calling someone on the operations floor. He had people there, junior staff, who owed him various things and who had developed the habit of keeping him informed of unusual activity. He reached for his phone and then stopped. If Min-jae was moving against him, making that call would expose the network. And if Min-jae wasn't moving yet, if he was still in the review stage, still building his case, then making the call would signal panic, and panic created mistakes. He put the phone down. He would leave on schedule, 60 hours. He would not deviate. I went to the window and looked at the street below. It was late. The street was quiet. A car was parked on the opposite side of the road that he didn't immediately recognize, but this was a residential area, and unfamiliar cars were not inherently unusual. He looked at it for 30 seconds. The car did not move. He went to bed and did not sleep. The morning came gray and wet, the way Seoul mornings sometimes did in that particular season. The sky the color of old concrete, the light arriving grudgingly, like it wasn't certain the day deserved it. Amara was already awake when it came. She had been awake since 4, which was not unusual lately, sitting at her kitchen counter with the preliminary plans for the Yongsan project spread out in front of her and a cup of coffee that had been hot 40 minutes ago. She was thinking about the phone call. She had not told her attorney about it. She had not told anyone about it. She had sat with it for 18 hours and rotated it in her mind from different angles, the way she rotated structural problems, looking for the load-bearing element, the thing that everything else depended on. The man on the phone had said, he doesn't know those calls were redirected. She had spent 3 years interpreting absence as intention. She had read every unanswered call, every canceled plan, every evening spent alone in a penthouse that was the size of her loneliness, as evidence of a choice he had made. And maybe he had made choices. She was not naive enough to believe that a man like Min-jae was without fault in a marriage that had failed. He was closed. He was consumed. He had a capacity for silence that could fill rooms. But there was a difference between a man who was closed and a man who had given orders to remove you from his life. She had believed the second thing because she had been given documents that said it. She had been given those documents by someone who, according to a voice on a phone she could not verify, had designed them specifically to make her believe it. She put her pencil down on the plans. She picked up her phone and searched the name Cho. Nothing useful. She searched Park Sung-ho, which she knew as a name from the organization. She had met him twice, briefly, at events she had attended as Min-jae's wife. He had been pleasant in a careful way, the kind of pleasant that was a performance of pleasant rather than the thing itself. She had filed that impression away and then forgotten about it because she had been busy, that year, learning to live inside a world that was not built for her. Her phone rang. Unknown number again. Her hand hovered over it for one full ring. Then she answered. It's moving faster than I thought. The same voice. You need to be careful today. Don't go out alone. Who are you? She said. Someone who's been watching this longer than you have. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. But it's what I can give you right now. A pause, traffic sounds. He was outside, moving. The man who sent you that document, he's running, and when people like him run, they clear their loose ends first. The word loose ends landed in her chest with a weight she hadn't anticipated. You're saying I'm a loose end, she said. I'm saying you might be in his calculation. And I'm saying that Kang Min-jae is aware of that and is dealing with it. Another pause. There are people watching your building, not to harm you, to make sure no one else does. She stood up from the counter. She walked to the window and looked left at the river and then dropped her gaze to the street below. A dark car, parked at the curb. She had noticed it yesterday and assumed parking. How do I know you're not part of this? She said. You don't, he said. Stay inside today. And then before she could respond, he's trying to protect you. I thought you should know that, whatever else you decide. The line went dead. She stood at the window for a long time with her phone pressed against her palm and looked at the car on the street and thought about what it meant to be protected by a man from a threat she hadn't known existed, inside a situation that had begun with her putting divorce papers on a table and walking away. At 9:15 that morning, Min-jae walked into the syndicate building, nodded at the lobby staff, and went directly to the operations room rather than his office. He stood in the center of it and looked at the 8 people who were present and said, with no preamble, I need everyone to clear the floor for 1 hour. Go to the second floor conference room. Someone will come get you. Nobody asked why. That was a function of who he was and how he spoke when he meant something absolutely. They filed out. He waited until the room was empty, then closed the door. He sat at the central monitoring station and pulled up the access logs for the past 6 months. Not the financial logs. Those were already in evidence, already understood. He pulled the communication logs, internal messages, system access records, administrative actions on shared accounts, the raw infrastructure of how the organization communicated with itself. He was looking for the 17 calls, found them in 40 minutes. They were logged as system redirects in the telecommunications management interface, an administrative tool that Seung-ho controlled in his capacity as operations head. Each of Amara's calls, logged by the syndicate's internal phone management system as incoming to Min-jae's mobile and redirected, per a standing routing rule, to an unmonitored voicemail archive. The rule had been created under Seung-ho's administrative credentials on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago, 4 days after Min-jae and Amara had returned from their honeymoon. 4 days after the honeymoon. Min-jae sat with that for a moment. 4 days. Before the marriage had settled into any shape at all, Seung-ho had already begun restructuring it. That kind of premeditation was not reactive. It was not a plan that emerged from opportunity. It was a plan that existed from the beginning, built around a specific assessment of how to exploit the relationship that Min-jae had just entered. He thought about himself 3 years ago. Coming back from Jeju with Amara, both of them still new to each other in the way of people who have made a large decision and are finding out what that decision feels like on the inside. He thought about what Seung-ho must have seen, a distraction, a vulnerability. A man who was, for the first time in 20 years, emotionally occupied in a way that created exposure. And Seung-ho had begun immediately, before Min-jae had even unpacked. Min-jae closed the access log. He sat in the empty operations room and looked at his hands on the desk and decided something. Not dramatically, not with any internal speech or moment of reckoning. Just a quiet, absolute decision that landed the way certain decisions do when they have been pending long enough. Without surprise, without weight, because you have already been carrying them and setting them down, is simply the next thing. He picked up his phone and called Seung-ho. It rang 4 times before Seung-ho picked up, which was 2 rings longer than usual. Boss. Smooth, unreadable, professional. My office, Min-jae said. Now. A beat. I'm reviewing the Busan documentation before Fridays. Now, Seung-ho. He hung up. He stood up from the monitoring station and walked to his office and sat behind his desk and waited. Seung-ho arrived in 7 minutes, which was about 4 minutes longer than the walk required. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn yesterday, which was unusual. Seung-ho was meticulous about his appearance in a way that Min-jae had always attributed to professional pride, and was now reassigning to the psychology of a man who needed to appear unimpeachable at all times. He came in and closed the door and sat down. The communication logs, Min-jae said. I pulled them this morning. Seung-ho's face did not move. All right. You created a routing rule in the telecommunications system 3 years ago, the week Amara and I came back from Jeju. I manage the telecom infrastructure, Seung-ho said. I create routing rules regularly. If there's a specific, this rule redirected all incoming calls from her number to an unmonitored archive. The office was very quiet. From somewhere below them, through the building's floor, came the distant sound of the elevator moving. There may have been a system error that Seung-ho, Min-jae said his name, just that. The same way he had said it the previous day, with the same register, the same absolute stillness. Don't. Seung-ho closed his mouth. For the first time in Min-jae's memory, he had nothing to insert into a silence. He sat in the chair and looked at the desk, and his face was the face of a man running calculations at a speed his expression couldn't quite conceal. The accounts, Min-jae said. The construction fronts, the federal contact. He watched Seung-ho's jaw tighten at the last one. I know about the contact. Seung-ho looked up. And here was the thing about Seung-ho, the thing that Min-jae registered now with the particular clarity of someone seeing a person correctly for the first time. He was not frightened. He was recalibrating. Even now, confronted with the fact that the architecture of his plan had been exposed, he was not frightened. He was calculating. That was who he was. That was who he had always been.
The fear should have been there, and it wasn't, and its absence told Min-jae something more fundamental than anything in the transaction logs. You went to the financial intelligence unit, Min-jae said. You gave them a package. Records connecting me to 4 operations. I don't know what records you built, structures you created in my name to move your money, and that you then handed to federal investigators as evidence against me. Seung-ho said nothing. You were going to let me sit in a courtroom while you left the country. Still nothing. Look at me, Min-jae said. Seung-ho looked at him. Tell me why. It was not an interrogator's question.
It was something rawer than that. The question of a man who has spent 14 years trusting someone and is now sitting across from the wreckage of that and wants, before anything else, to understand how it was possible. Seung-ho was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was stripped of all its professional smoothness, down to something older and more honest. Because you would never have given me what I built. You would have given me salary and position and loyalty. But the actual money, the percentage that matched what I put in, you would never have given that. So you took it. I built half of what this organization is. The Daejeon structure, the port contracts, the Macau routing. I built those. You would have given me a title and a car. Min-jae looked at him. He felt something that was not quite anger. Anger was too simple for it. It was closer to the feeling of discovering that a load-bearing wall has been hollow for years, that the thing you depended on to hold the structure up was never solid, and you simply did not check. And Amara, Min-jae said. Seung-ho's eyes shifted slightly, the first involuntary movement he had made. She was a distraction you couldn't afford, Seung-ho said. You were in love with her and it was making you soft. You stopped being precise. You started missing things. So you decided to manage it. I decided to manage you. He said it without an apology. The way I managed everything, because someone had to. Min-jae stood up. Seung-ho stood up too, instinctively, the way people stand when the atmosphere in a room changes. You're going to call your people, Seung-ho said. His voice was steadier than his eyes. And that's your right. But before you do, the federal package is already in their hands. If anything happens to me, they'll know where to look and what it means. I made sure of that. He had. Min-jae believed him. That was the last piece of the architecture. The dead man's switch. The thing that made Seung-ho not entirely without leverage, even now, cornered and exposed, in an office he had spent years treating as his own. Get out of this building, Min-jae said. Seung-ho blinked. I'm not going to have you touched here. Get out of the building and go wherever you're going. You have until Thursday morning. He looked at him with something that was not mercy and not hatred, but was perhaps the thing that exists between them when you have known someone long enough to understand exactly how they failed you. If you're still in the country Thursday afternoon, that changes. Seung-ho held his gaze for a moment. Then he picked up the jacket he had draped over the chair arm and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the door. For what it's worth, Seung-ho said, she was never in the plan, the woman. I didn't intend for her to get hurt. Get out, Min-jae said. Seung-ho left. Min-jae stood behind his desk and listened to the sound of the elevator arriving and departing, and then to the silence of the building around him, and then he sat down very slowly in his chair and put his head in his hands. Not for long. 30 seconds, maybe. The amount of time it takes to let a thing be real before you have to start handling it. Then he lifted his head and picked up his phone and called Yoon. He's leaving the building now, he said. Don't lose him, and don't touch him until I say. Understood. Yoon paused. There's something else. My source at the Financial Intelligence Unit just flagged movement. They accelerated the review. They're filing for warrants today, not in 5 days. Min-jae's hand tightened on the phone. Today. My source says the package Seung-ho delivered had something in it they weren't expecting, something that fast-tracked authorization at the director level. Yoon's voice was careful, the way it got when the information was bad and he was aware it was bad. It's not just the 4 operations anymore. They have a name, yours, connected to something international. A cargo operation through Busan that touches a Japanese organization the unit has been building a case against for 2 years. Min-jae stood up. That operation is real, Yoon said. You were part of it. I don't know how Seung-ho knew about it or how he documented it, but if he handed them that, he handed them everything, Min-jae said. He built the books for that operation too. The room was very still. Min-jae. Yoon used his name without the title, which he had done perhaps 4 times in their entire history. If the warrants go through today, you have maybe 6 hours before they move on the building. 6 hours. Seung-ho had known this. He had accelerated the federal timeline deliberately, not as a contingency, but as a first strike. Hand the investigators something that required immediate action, then run while the authorities were preoccupied with Min-jae, while Min-jae was preoccupied with the investigation, while everything collapsed around the center of gravity that Seung-ho had spent 3 years carefully positioning Min-jae to occupy. And Amara was still in her apartment in Mapogu, with 2 of Yoon's people watching a street below a window where the river was visible if you leaned left. Min-jae walked to the window, looked at Seoul, all of it, the sprawl and the lights and the money and the power and the 20 years of everything he had built through methods he had never apologized for, because apology was not a currency he had ever traded in. 6 hours. He could try to contain it. He could call his lawyers. The syndicate had 4, 2 of whom were exceptional, and begin the process of discrediting Seung-ho's fabricated records, demonstrating the shell company construction, building the counter case that would eventually, months from now or years from now, establish the truth. He could do all of that. Or he could go get Seung-ho before Seung-ho reached Incheon, before the charter flight and the Macau accounts and the apartment where he would watch the news. And he could do it in a way that did not involve 6 months of courtrooms. And there was a woman in a 4th-floor apartment who was in Seung-ho's contingency plan, and who had received a document designed to break something in her that might not otherwise have broken, and who had spent 3 years believing a lie that had been engineered at the level of precision that went into things you didn't do by accident. Min-jae looked at the city. He picked up his jacket. He called Yoon. "Where is he now?" "Still in the building's parking structure. He's been in his car for 8 minutes. "He's waiting to make sure I'm not following immediately," Min-jae said. "He'll move in the next 5 minutes. When he does, you tell me every turn he makes. And the warrants? Handle the legal team. Send them everything Yoon's file documented about the shell companies. Tell them to be ready to move the moment the investigators make contact." He walked toward the door. "But that's the secondary problem." "What's the primary?" "Getting to him before he gets to her," Min-jae said, and walked out. Seung-ho's car moved at 9:47. Yoon's voice came through Min-jae's earpiece as he was crossing the lobby. "He's heading south on Mapodaero, not toward Incheon." Min-jae stopped walking. South on Mapodaero was not the airport route. South on Mapodaero was Mapogu. "He's going to her building," Min-jae said. "That's what it looks like." Min-jae was already moving before the sentence finished. Through the lobby doors, into the gray morning air, into the back of his car before his driver had fully processed that he was coming. "Mapogu, the fastest way. Now!" His driver pulled out without asking anything else. That was what Min-jae paid him for. The not asking. Min-jae sat in the back seat and watched the city move past the window and kept Yoon in his ear. Seung-ho's car was 11 minutes ahead. Morning traffic was the variable. Seoul at 9:50 in the morning was not Seoul at 2 in the morning, and the roads between Seung-ho's position and Amara's building were not clean roads. "The 2 people you have on her building," Min-jae said, "they're outside, street level. Can they get to her floor?" "One of them can. I'll send him up now." "Do it." Min-jae looked at the traffic ahead and calculated. "And call her." "She doesn't know who I am." "Call her anyway. Tell her to lock her door and don't open it for anyone until I get there." A pause. "And if she asks who's calling?" "Tell her it's someone who works for her husband," Min-jae said. "She'll understand what that means." He did not know if she would. I was trusting something. Not logic, not calculation. Just the thing that was left when all the managed distance between them had been stripped away by 3 years of engineered silence. He was trusting that she would hear the message and know it was real. Traffic on Mapodaero thickened. His driver took a left without being told, cutting through a residential block, adding 30 seconds of distance for the benefit of avoiding a light that was already backed up 4 cars deep. Min-jae gripped the door handle without squeezing it, an old habit, something to hold while he thought. Seung-ho's contingency had always been about time. Everything Seung-ho did was about time. The slow accumulation of advantage, the patient construction of exits. But this was different. This was Seung-ho accelerated, operating on a compressed timeline, and compressed timelines made people imprecise in ways they weren't when they had room to breathe. Imprecise was dangerous in a different way than precise. Precise you could anticipate. Imprecise you couldn't. Yoon's voice again. He turned onto her street. He's parking. Min-jae felt his chest tighten once, and then release. He did not allow it to tighten again. How far out am I? 6 minutes? Maybe 5. 5 minutes was a long time. He had spent 20 years understanding exactly how much could happen in 5 minutes, and he did not permit himself to enumerate those things now because enumeration would not make the car move faster and would cost him the clarity he needed. The man you sent up to her floor, he said. He's there? He's in the stairwell outside her door. She didn't open when he knocked. He could hear her inside. Good. She had locked herself in. She was staying. Tell him to stay in the stairwell, visible to her door. Nobody gets past him. Understood. Min-jae's driver ran a yellow light at the intersection onto her street, and Min-jae saw the building. 4 stories, pale exterior, a small convenience store at street level that he would not have been able to describe before today, but that he would remember for the rest of his life. And he saw Seung-ho's car parked at the curb 50 meters back, driver's door open, Seung-ho not in it. He's already inside, Min-jae said. He was out of his own car before it fully stopped. The building entrance was a glass door with a keypad. Min-jae hit it at speed, shoulder first, not with enough force to break it. The door swung inward, unlocked, which meant Seung-ho had gotten in the same way, had held it open or caught it behind a resident, or simply walked in when someone else walked out. Easy. The building was not built for people like either of them. The elevator was on the 3rd floor, ascending. Taking it would be slower than the stairs. Min-jae took the stairs. His footsteps on concrete, 1 flight, 2nd floor, the sound of his own breathing registering as information rather than sensation, controlled, not labored, not yet. He was fit, always had been. The body maintained the way he maintained everything about himself, because the alternative was vulnerability. 2nd flight, 3rd floor. He could hear the elevator arriving above him as he hit the 4th floor landing. The stairwell door opened onto a corridor, dim fluorescent light. 4 doors. And at the far end, outside the 2nd door from the end, his man, standing with his back to the wall, and in front of the door, facing that man with his body angled in a way that was designed to appear casual and communicating something else entirely. Seung-ho. He had something in his left hand. Small. He was holding it at his side, not raised, but the hold was deliberate. Min-jae walked down the corridor. Seung-ho heard him and turned. For a moment, the 3 of them were arranged in the corridor in a geometry that nobody moved to change. Seung-ho's man, Min-jae's man, technically, against the wall. Seung-ho in front of the door. Min-jae at the end of the corridor, 10 meters away, hands at his sides, jacket open. You said Thursday, Seung-ho said. I lied, Min-jae said. He kept walking, steady pace, the kind of pace that does not hurry because hurrying would give Seung-ho something to react to. What's in your left hand? Seung-ho raised it. A phone. Not a weapon. He held it up so Min-jae could see it clearly. 1 message, Seung-ho said. That's all it takes. I have a contact at the Financial Intelligence Unit who's waiting for confirmation that I'm clear of the country. If he doesn't get it by 10 this morning, he files the warrant documentation immediately and names your location. Min-jae stopped 6 feet away from him. He looked at the phone and then at Seung-ho's face. The face was held steady, but there was something in the eyes that had not been there in the office. The high, tight alertness of a man who is aware that his plan has not gone the way the plan was supposed to go and is now improvising at the edge of what his preparation covers. Step away from the door, Min-jae said. I'm not here to hurt her, Seung-ho said. I want you to understand that. I came here to bring her somewhere safe while you came here because you know I wouldn't move on you while she was in your reach, Min-jae said. Don't explain it to me like I'm going to believe a different version. Seung-ho's jaw tightened. Step away from the door, Min-jae said again. The moment I do that, the moment you do that, nothing happens to you in this corridor. I give you my word. He said it quietly and completely, the way he had given his word on the handful of occasions in his life when he had meant it without reservation. You walk out of this building and you get in your car. You go to Incheon and you get on your charter and you go wherever you're going. I won't stop you today. And tomorrow? Tomorrow is a different conversation. Sung-ho stared at him. The calculation was visible, running behind his eyes, checking the offer against every angle he could access, looking for the trap. He was good at finding traps. He had built enough of them. Why? Sung-ho said. Because she's worth more to me than you are, Min-jae said simply. Something moved across Sung-ho's face that was almost, not quite, recognition. Then the door behind Sung-ho opened. Amara opened it from the inside with the chain still latched, which meant she could see through a 4-inch gap. Enough to see the corridor, enough to see the 3 men in it and what they were doing, which was standing at a distance that meant something and holding positions that meant something else. She had been listening. Min-jae could hear it in the silence of it. She had been at the door, not in the kitchen, not in the back of the apartment. She had heard them and stayed and put her hand on the door handle and made a decision about opening it. Amara, Min-jae said. Not a warning, just her name. Through the gap in the door, he could see part of her face. One eye, the line of her jaw, her hand on the chain. She looked at him and did not speak. Stay inside, he said. Don't take the chain off. I know what's happening, she said. Her voice was steady in a way that cost something. He could hear the cost of it. I've been listening. Then you know it's almost over. Is it? He held her gaze through the 4-inch gap and said, yes. Sung-ho stepped away from the door. He did it without another word, which was its own kind of statement. A man accepting a geometry he didn't choose because the alternative had gotten worse than the offer. He moved past Min-jae toward the stairwell, keeping his body angled so that his back was never fully turned. Professional habit, old instinct. Min-jae let him pass without moving. At the stairwell door, Sung-ho stopped. The federal package, he said, not turning around. Even if I'm gone, it exists. They have it. I know, Min-jae said. You're going to spend the next year in courtrooms. Probably. Sung-ho seemed to consider that. Then he pushed open the stairwell door and went through it, and the door closed behind him with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Min-jae nodded at his man, who went to the stairwell door and positioned himself there. Then Min-jae turned to face Amara's door. The chain was still on. She was still in the gap. They looked at each other through 4 inches of space for a moment that lasted long enough to contain several things that neither of them said. Are you all right? Min-jae said. Yes. A beat. Are you? He considered the honest answer to that question, which was complex and not suited to a corridor. I will be, he said. She nodded, once, slowly. I need to go, he said. Sung-ho isn't going to stop moving and I can't let him reach Incheon. I just needed to make sure he wasn't… He stopped himself, rearranged. I needed to know you were safe. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Go. He went. He hit the stairwell 30 seconds behind Sung-ho and took the stairs at a pace that was close to a run, controlled descent, hand on the railing only briefly at each landing to manage momentum. First floor, lobby. Through the glass door and out into the gray morning, and there was Sung-ho already at his car, getting in, the engine starting as Min-jae cleared the building entrance. Min-jae did not run. He walked at speed to his own car, which his driver had pulled forward to the curb, and he got in and said, Follow him. Don't let him see us doing it. His driver pulled into traffic 3 cars behind Sung-ho. Min-jae got Yoon back on the line. He's heading for Incheon. I've got 2 cars near the highway entrance, Yoon said. If he takes the Gyeongbu Expressway… He's not taking the expressway, Min-jae said. He's smarter than that. He knows we have people on the main routes. He'll take the coastal road through Sihung. A pause. That road has a section under construction, reduced to 1 lane for about 2 kilometers near the Sore Junction. Min-jae thought about that. 1 lane, 2 kilometers, reduced speed. A man in a hurry. In a car he was driving himself because the fewer people who knew his movements, the better. Navigating a construction zone with 1 eye on his mirrors. Get someone to the Sore Junction, he said, before he does. Already moving, Yoon said. Traffic thinned as they moved out of the city's dense core and onto the routes heading southwest. The gray morning had not improved. The clouds were lower now, the kind of sky that had been threatening rain for hours, and was finally getting serious about it. Min-jae watched the drops begin on the windshield and his driver turned on the wipers without being asked. Sung-ho was 2 cars ahead, moving at the speed of someone who was not trying to appear hurried. They drove like that for 20 minutes, controlled distance, 3 cars minimum between them. His driver was good, had been doing this kind of work for 11 years, and he varied the distance naturally, accelerated through gaps when Sung-ho's car might have been watching the mirror, settled back when the road straightened. Then Seung-ho's car changed lanes, not toward an exit, a sharp move to the right across 2 lanes, using a gap in traffic with a precision that said he'd been watching his mirrors the whole time and had just decided he'd seen enough. "He made us," Min-jae said. His driver was already moving, following the lane change, and now the distance between the 2 cars collapsed from 3 cars to 1 in the span of seconds, because there was no more pretending. Sung-ho accelerated. His driver accelerated. The highway opened up around them as the city density fell away, broader and faster, and now they were simply 2 cars, and the distance between them was a thing that was either shrinking or growing, and everything depended on which. Sung-ho was driving a 3-year-old Kia that was fine for city work and not built for this. Min-jae's car was a Mercedes S-Class that his driver had pushed past 160 on 2 previous occasions that Min-jae was aware of. The gap closed. Sung-ho took an exit, not the Sihung Coastal Road. An earlier exit, Seo-Incheon, older roads, narrower, the kind of industrial back approach to the port areas that you knew if you had been moving cargo through this region for 20 years, which Seung-ho had. His driver followed. The roads here were different, narrower, 2 lanes, with the particular texture of pavement that has been repaired too many times and shows its history in the surface. Industrial facilities on both sides, warehouses, container yards, a cement plant whose smoke was mixing with the low clouds in a way that made the air thick. They were the only 2 cars on this stretch of road, and the pretense was completely gone now, replaced by something starker and more honest. Sung-ho's car pushed harder on the straight, and Min-jae's driver matched it, and then exceeded it, and the gap came down to 40 meters, and then 30, and then Seung-ho did something Min-jae's driver did not expect. He braked. Hard. Not a panic stop. A controlled, intentional brake in the middle of a straightaway, exactly calculated to make the car behind react. Min-jae's driver reacted correctly, counterbraked and pulled right instead of hitting him, and the Mercedes went onto the shoulder, gravel, and wet grass before recovering back to the road. Sung-ho was already accelerating again, taking the gap he'd created, pulling 30 meters ahead, and then making a sharp left into a facility entrance that Min-jae registered as a disused cargo terminal. Chain-link fencing, a broken gate that had been pushed inward, the skeleton of a building behind it with half its corrugated roof missing. His driver followed through the gate. Inside the terminal compound, the ground was broken concrete and standing water from the overnight rain. 3 disused cargo containers on the left, stacked too high. A main warehouse building ahead, its loading bay doors open on one end, dark inside. Sung-ho's car had stopped 20 meters in, driver's door open. Sung-ho not in it. He had gone inside. Min-jae's driver stopped the car and Min-jae got out. He looked at the warehouse. The open loading bay was 12 meters wide and opened onto a darkness that his eyes would need a moment to adjust to. He could hear the rain on the corrugated sections of roof that were still intact. He could hear his own breathing. He looked back at his driver. "Stay with the car." He walked toward the loading bay. Inside, the warehouse was vast and mostly empty. The bones of a cargo operation that had been abandoned mid-function, which meant there were still things in it. Old wooden pallets stacked against one wall, rusted metal shelving units, an industrial scale in the center of the floor that had not moved in years. Light came through the gaps in the roof in narrow columns where the panels had failed, and through the open bay behind him, and through a broken window high on the east wall. It was enough light to move by, not enough to be certain of anything at a distance. Min-jae stood in the loading bay entrance and waited for his eyes. "I know this wasn't how you wanted this to end," Sung-ho's voice. From the right, behind the shelving units, maybe 15 meters in, impossible to pinpoint exactly. "How I wanted it to end is not the relevant question anymore," Min-jae said. He moved to the left as he spoke, away from the bay entrance, away from the silhouette he'd been presenting. Old habit. "The federal warrants are going to come through regardless," Sung-ho said. His voice moved. He was moving too, repositioning in the dark, the way men do who have been in situations before where the room was the only resource available. Even if you stop me here, the package is already filed. You can't unfile it. I know. Then what does this accomplish? It keeps you from getting on a plane, Min Jae said. It keeps you in the country where your testimony matters. He moved again, right this time, circling the center of the floor, keeping the shelving in his peripheral. The only thing that kills the federal case is you testifying to what you built and who built it. A good attorney can work with that. A missing witness in Macau is harder. A silence. The rain on the roof. Water dripping somewhere through a gap and hitting the concrete floor in a slow, irregular rhythm. You'd use my testimony, Seung-ho said. He sounded, for the first time, genuinely uncertain, not about the physical situation, but about the logic of it. After everything. I'd use every legal mechanism available to dismantle what you handed to federal investigators, Min Jae said. Yes, including you. He stopped moving. He was near the pallets now. But you have to be here for that. You have to be in the country, in a room with attorneys talking. Another silence. Longer. And if I don't agree to that, then we're in this building until one of us makes a decision, Min Jae said. And I've made more decisions in buildings like this than you have. He heard the movement before he saw it. The shift of weight on broken concrete, the specific sound of a shoe on grit. And he stepped back and left simultaneously, and the figure that came out from behind the shelving unit hit the space where he'd been standing and then adjusted, grabbed at his jacket, connected with his shoulder. They went into the stack of pallets together. The impact scattered the top pallet, and Min Jae felt the edge of it across his back, sharp, the pain registering clean and honest, no adrenaline buffer on it. He pivoted and got his forearm up and redirected Seung-ho's momentum rather than blocking it, a technique from a system he had learned at 22 and had not needed to use at this proximity in several years. Seung-ho was not untrained. He was smaller than Min Jae by 2 inches and lighter by 15 kilos, but he was compact and had the aggressive efficiency of someone who had studied how to compensate for size. And he came back immediately, driving at Min Jae's midsection, trying to take him down. Min Jae didn't go down. He planted and took the collision and wrapped one arm around Seung-ho's back and stopped the momentum by making himself the wall. They were locked for a moment, both breathing hard now, the sound of it loud in the warehouse. And Min Jae could feel Seung-ho's hands searching for leverage, for a grip, for the specific angle that would change the geometry. Min Jae found his first. He shifted his weight left and brought Seung-ho down onto the concrete on his back with a force that was controlled, but not gentle. The impact was audible. Seung-ho's breath left him, all of it, in one expelled moment, and for 2 seconds he was simply a body catching up with what had just happened to it. Min Jae knelt over him, one knee on the ground, one hand on Seung-ho's chest. Not a choke, not a strike, just weight and position, making the geometry clear. They looked at each other, both breathing. The rain on the roof, the dripping water, the distant sound of Min Jae's driver outside. Seung-ho's face, in the gray light from the broken window, was the face of a man who has arrived at the end of a road he built himself, and is only now fully understanding the distance he traveled to get here. 460 million won, Min Jae said. I wasn't angry. He was something colder than anger, more specific. And you destroyed my marriage to cover it. Seung-ho looked at the ceiling of the warehouse, the broken roof, the gray sky through the gaps. Call Yoon, Min Jae said, not to Seung-ho. To the empty warehouse, knowing his driver had followed him in when he heard the collision and was now standing near the bay entrance. Tell him we need the attorneys here, and a car to take this man somewhere while we figure out what exactly he's willing to say to the Financial Intelligence Unit in exchange for a reduced... His phone buzzed. He straightened up and looked at the screen. Yoon, text, not a call. 3 words and a number that changed everything. Federal team. Incheon. Now. Min Jae read it twice. They weren't heading for the building. They weren't after the syndicate's offices. They had gone to Incheon International, to the private charter terminal, which meant someone had told them where Seung-ho was planning to exit, and that someone had given them a timeline precise enough to put them at the terminal before the man they were looking for had arrived. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Yoon's source had flipped, or the federal investigators had a second source inside the operation that neither Yoon nor Min Jae knew about. Min Jae looked at Seung-ho on the ground. Who else did you talk to? He said. Seung-ho met his eyes and said nothing, and in the silence of that non-answer, in the particular quality of it, Min-jae felt the ground shift under the whole situation in a way he had not prepared for and could not immediately calculate. Seung-ho looked at the ceiling for a long moment. The broken roof, the gray sky coming through in pieces. The rain had softened to something barely there, more mist than rain, the kind that settles on everything without committing to falling. Then he said, "Cho." Min-jae waited. "I used Cho to move information, to Amara, to federal contacts, to the charter terminal logistics." Seung-ho's voice was flat now, emptied of the professional smoothness it had carried for 14 years. What was left underneath was something older and more tired. Cho has been talking to someone inside the financial intelligence unit independently, not through me. I found out 3 weeks ago, and I thought I had it contained. You didn't, Min-jae said. No. Min-jae stood up. He looked down at Seung-ho on the concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but was perhaps the territory between them. The feeling you have for a man who is genuinely capable and chose to aim that capability at the wrong things and is now lying on broken concrete in a building that smells like rust and old water, running out of options he built for himself. Get up, Min-jae said. Seung-ho got up slowly. He was favoring his left side from the fall, his breathing not fully recovered, a hand pressed briefly to his ribs as he straightened. He did not ask for help, and Min-jae did not offer it. Cho gave the federal team the charter terminal information, Min-jae said, which means they're waiting at a location you're not going to reach, which means your exit is gone. I understand what it means, Seung-ho said. Then you understand that the only remaining question is what happens next. Min-jae looked at him steadily. You can try to run again. You have no car, no exit route, a federal team 40 minutes from here, and at least 2 of my people on this property. Or you can decide to be useful. Useful, Seung-ho repeated. The word came out with a particular quality. Not bitter, exactly. More like a man tasting something he had not expected. The fabricated records, the shell companies, the construction fronts. Min-jae picked up his jacket from where it had fallen against the pallet. You built them. You know every thread. You're the only person who can demonstrate specifically and verifiably that those structures were designed to implicate me rather than document me. He put the jacket on. That testimony is worth something to a federal prosecutor who has been handed a complicated case and wants it to be simple. I'd be testifying against myself. You'd be negotiating, Min-jae said. There's a difference. And you know the difference because you've been negotiating your entire career. Seung-ho stood in the warehouse light, gray from above, gray from the open bay behind them, the whole building a study in the color of things that have given up on their original purpose, and looked at Min-jae with an expression that had nothing managed in it. No performance, no calculation visible on the surface. Just a man assessing a situation he had not planned for because he had not believed it was reachable. You'd let your own attorneys use me, Seung-ho said, to clear you. I'd let the legal process use you, Min-jae said. Same thing, different frame. And what do I get? You get to stay in the country. You get attorneys. You get a process. Min-jae looked at him. And you get to stop running, which, by my count, you've been doing for about 3 years, whether you were standing still or not. Something in Seung-ho's face shifted, not dramatically, just a small movement around the eyes, the particular muscle loosening that happens when a person lets go of a position they have been holding too long. He looked at the ground. He nodded once. Min-jae turned to his driver, who was standing near the loading bay entrance, having witnessed all of it with the professional detachment of a man who understood that his job was to be present and to drive and to remember nothing specifically. Call Yoon. Tell him we need the attorneys at the Mapo office within the hour, and tell him to contact the financial intelligence unit. I want to know the name of the agent in charge. His driver made the call. Seung-ho stood in the middle of the warehouse floor with his hands at his sides and looked at the industrial scale in the center of the room. Rusted, tilted slightly on its base, the platform surface filmed with years of settled dust. He looked at it the way people sometimes look at objects that have no relevance to anything except that their eyes need somewhere to land. The anniversary reservation, he said. Not to Min-jae specifically, to the space between them, The way people say things they have carried too long and need to set somewhere outside themselves. The first one, I almost didn't intercept it. He paused. I had the routing already set up. I just had to let it run. And for about an hour, I didn't activate it. He looked up. Then I did. Min-jae looked at him. I don't know why I'm telling you that, Sung-ho said. Yes, you do, Min-jae said. Sung-ho said nothing. He looked back at the scale. Min-jae walked out of the warehouse into the gray morning and stood on the broken concrete of the terminal yard and breathed the air, wet and industrial, and carrying the particular smell of proximity to the sea, salt mixed with diesel, the smell of the port areas that he had worked in and around for 20 years. He stood there for a moment with his face turned slightly into the damp air and felt the particular quality of a situation that has reached its crisis point and come through it into something that was not yet resolution, but was at least no longer emergency. His back hurt where the pallet edge had caught it. He had a cut on his left hand from somewhere in the fall that he had not noticed during the fight and was noticing now. Small, the kind of thing that bleeds more than it warrants. He pressed his thumb against it and looked at the gray sky and thought about what came next. What came next was not simple. He knew that with the same clarity he knew the cut on his hand was real. The federal case was not going to dissolve because Seung-ho was willing to testify. It was going to be a process, months, possibly more than a year, of attorneys and documents and courtrooms, and the particular grinding erosion of having your professional life dissected by people whose job was to find the worst interpretation of everything. He was going to lose things during that process. Perhaps money, certainly time, possibly aspects of the operation that could not survive the scrutiny. He had built the Baeko Syndicate over 20 years through methods that were not all defensible, and some of which he was not proud of, and none of which he was going to pretend had not happened. He was going to have to account for those. Not necessarily in a courtroom, that depended on what the attorneys could build, but in himself, in the way a man accounts for things when he has finally run out of noise to put between himself and the reckoning. He was 41 years old. He had controlled a significant portion of Seoul's criminal infrastructure since he was 32. He had run it well, by its own standards, with a kind of internal code that the outside world would not recognize as such, but that had nonetheless structured his decisions, limited certain excesses, prevented specific kinds of harm he had the power to prevent. He was not under any illusion about the nature of what he had built. He had simply believed, for 20 years, that what he built was the primary thing, the defining thing. The thing that answered the question of who he was. He was beginning to understand, in the gray morning air of a disused cargo terminal, that he had been working from an incomplete definition. He took out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he called Amara. It rang 3 times. He counted them. She picked up. It's over, he said. He did not explain. He did not know if over was even the accurate word. It was the beginning of a long process, not an ending. But it was over in the way that mattered, in the immediate physical sense of people being safe, and the man who had constructed 3 years of deliberate damage being out of options. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing on the line, even and measured, the sound of a woman who has been holding something tightly for several hours and is deciding whether to put it down. Are you hurt? She said. He looked at the cut on his hand. Not significantly. That's not the same as no. No, he said. It's not. Another pause. I don't know what to do with any of this, she said. Not helplessly, with the particular honesty of someone stating a true thing about a complex situation. I've been in this apartment since your man knocked on my door this morning, and I've been sitting here understanding, in increments, what actually happened, and I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it today, he said. Min-jae. I know. He did know. He knew that telling her she didn't have to do anything with it was the same kind of answer he had been giving for 3 years. The answer that was designed to hold complexity at a distance rather than engage with it. He stopped himself. I'm sorry. That was the wrong thing to say. She was quiet again, a different quality of quiet this time. I'll come to you, he said. Not today. Today I have to handle the legal situation, and I have to be present for that. But tomorrow, if you'll let me, I'd like to come. To say what? She said. To say what I should have been saying for 3 years, he said, and to listen to what you should have been able to say. The line was quiet for long enough that he thought she might have ended the call.
Then she said, "Okay." Just that. One word. He held it. "Okay," he said back. He hung up and stood in the yard with the phone in his hand and the mist settling on the shoulders of his jacket and the sound of Yoon's cars arriving at the terminal gate behind him, and he allowed himself 30 seconds of standing there before he turned around and walked back toward everything that still had to be handled. The next 4 weeks were the hardest work Min-jae had done in 20 years, and they were hard in a different way than anything in those 20 years had been hard. Criminal work, the actual operation of a syndicate, the management of competing interests and physical threats and financial complexity, was hard in ways he was designed for. It engaged the part of him that was built for pressure, that metabolized threat into focus, that functioned better under constraint than without it. Legal work was hard in the way of things that move slowly and cannot be hurried. His attorneys, 4 of them, including the 2 who were exceptional, worked 16-hour days building the countercase from Yoon's documentation and Seung-ho's cooperation, which turned out to be more complete than Min-jae had anticipated. Seung-ho, having decided to cooperate, cooperated with the same methodical thoroughness he had brought to everything else. He documented the shell companies from their inception. He produced the communication system records showing his administrative access and the routing rules. He provided the financial mechanics of the theft in enough detail that even the federal investigators, who were not inclined toward sympathy for anyone involved, acknowledged the coherence of the picture it created. It did not dissolve the federal case. The Busan cargo operation was real, and Min-jae's role in it was real, and that was going to require its own negotiation, its own accounting. But it fundamentally changed the character of the case, from a simple prosecution of an organized crime boss into a complex investigation of internal betrayal that implicated a key witness and compromised a significant portion of the original evidence. Prosecutors did not like compromised evidence. They liked cases that held together under scrutiny. What they had, after Seung-ho's testimony, was a case with a large fracture running through its center, and fractures of that kind were expensive to argue around. Min-jae's lead attorney, a woman named Han Ji-young, who had been practicing criminal defense for 28 years and who communicated exclusively in declarative sentences, told him at the end of the 3rd week, "We're not getting everything dismissed, but we're getting enough. And what remains can be addressed over time with cooperation on the Busan operation details." "Define cooperation," Min-jae said. "Information about the Japanese organization you worked with. Structural details they can use to build their separate case." She looked at him across her desk without sentiment. "You'll be giving them something and they'll be reducing what they take from you. Standard trade. The Japanese organization has people who would object to that." "Then you'll need to manage that objection," she said. "That's outside my area." It was, and he managed it. Over 2 weeks of calls and meetings, he would not describe in any detail to anyone, he reached arrangements that were uncomfortable and costly in multiple currencies and held. He had done harder things. He had done them without anyone knowing he was doing them, which was the nature of the work. The public face of the syndicate, whatever remained of it after the investigations and the restructuring, was never going to reflect the specific texture of what keeping it viable required. What changed during those 4 weeks was not external. The external things were in process, legal, financial, organizational, and they would take the time they took. What changed was something interior, something that happened in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning when he was in his penthouse alone and not working, and therefore unable to avoid the thing he had been using work to avoid for, now that he was counting, a very long time. He had run the Baeko Syndicate on the principle that clarity of purpose was the highest virtue. Know what you're building and build it without deviation. He had applied this to everything: strategy, personnel, finance, every decision that touched the organization. He had been, by this standard, extremely successful. He had applied a different standard to his marriage. Or rather, and this was the honest accounting, done at 2 in the morning without the buffer of work or noise. He had not applied any standard to his marriage. He had let it run in the background. He had assumed it would hold because he had built it, and things he built held, and therefore he did not need to attend to it the way he attended to things that required active maintenance. He had been wrong about this in a way that was entirely his own, entirely independent of what Seung-ho had done. Seung-ho had accelerated the damage. Seung-ho had engineered specific moments of failure, had intercepted communication, had cultivated isolation.
All of that was Sung-ho's doing, and Min-jae was not going to carry it. But a marriage does not become vulnerable to that kind of interference when it is well tended. It becomes vulnerable when one person has already created enough absence that manufactured absence can pass undetected. Sung-ho had not invented the distance. He had exploited it. That was Min-jae's piece. He was clear about it. He sat with it in the dark of the penthouse at 2 in the morning and did not look away from it. He went to Amara's apartment on a Thursday, 5 weeks after the warehouse. He did not send advance notice because he had told her he would come and then not come for 5 weeks. And sending advance notice after that felt like a kind of administrative distance that the situation did not need more of. He simply went. He took the subway, which he had not done in probably 3 years because taking the subway meant arriving alone and unremarkable, which was what this visit required. He stood in front of her building and looked at the keypad and realized he did not know the code and pressed the buzzer for her unit. A pause. Then her voice through the intercom, slightly staticky. "Yes." "It's me," he said. Another pause. Then the door buzzed open. He took the stairs. 4th floor. Her door was at the end of the corridor, and as he walked toward it, he passed the spot where he and Seong-ho had stood 5 weeks ago in the bad light, and the corridor looked different in the daytime. Smaller, more ordinary, the walls a shade of beige that was completely unremarkable. Places that have held large events almost always look smaller afterward. He did not know why he had expected differently. She opened the door before he knocked. She was wearing a gray sweater and had a pencil tucked behind her ear, which meant she had been working. There was a smudge of something, graphite maybe, from drafting, on the side of her right hand. She looked at him and he looked at her and neither of them said anything for a moment. She looked the same and different, the way people do when you have not seen them in a particular kind of time. Same height, same face, same quality of attention in her eyes that had been one of the first things he noticed about her. Different in some way he could not specify. Something in the set of her shoulders, something in the way she was standing in the doorway of a space that was entirely hers, that she had made and organized and occupied on her own terms. "You came by subway," she said. She had seen his hands, no phone in either one, the way he usually arrived at things. "Yes." "Come in," she said. The apartment was small. He registered it and made no comment about it. On the wall above the kitchen counter, she had pinned a series of sketches, architectural, preliminary drawings with dimensions annotated in her small, precise hand. There was a drafting table set up near the window where the view of the river was visible, and she had placed her desk lamp at an angle that suggested she had figured out exactly where the morning light fell and positioned her work to meet it. It was a space someone had thought about. Someone had made it deliberately functional and had not bothered to make it comfortable beyond what was genuinely needed. And there was something about that, about the absence of concession to appearance, that told him more about the past 3 years than anything she could have said. She made tea. He did not offer to help, and she did not ask for it. He sat at the kitchen counter on a stool that was clearly the only seating option at that height, and she moved around the small kitchen with the ease of someone in a space that fits them, and the ordinariness of the scene. 2 people in a kitchen, tea being made, outside the gray Seoul afternoon going about its business, had a particular weight to it that he did not try to name. She set a cup in front of him and held her own and looked at him. "You didn't come for 5 weeks, she said. Not an accusation, a statement with a question inside it. "The legal situation," he said. "There were things that required—" "Min-jae." She said his name the way he sometimes said hers. Quietly, completely, in a way that meant, "Don't give me the managed version." He stopped. "I didn't come," he said, "because I didn't know how to come. Because showing up here is different from every other thing I've done in the past 5 weeks, and I'm better at those things." He looked at his hands on the counter. "That's the honest answer." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, once, slowly, as though his honesty had confirmed something she had been sitting with. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. When I put those divorce papers on the table, I need you to know that wasn't because of the anonymous documents. I hadn't received them yet. That was just me." She met his eyes steadily. "That was 3 years of being in a life that I had built around a person who was present at the beginning and then less present. And I need you to understand that Seong-ho was not responsible for all of it." "I know," Min-jae said. "I don't think you do," she said. I think you've been doing the accounting and you've been putting Seung-ho in the column for things that belong in yours. She said it without heat, because that's easier. The kitchen was quiet. The tea steamed. Outside, something, a bus maybe, went past on the street below. You stopped seeing me, she said, before any of the interference. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because if we're going to have this conversation, we need to have the actual conversation, and not a version of it where the villain removes all your agency. He sat with that. He did not rush it, did not try to answer it before it had fully landed. Yes, he said finally. Yes, what? Yes, I stopped seeing you. He looked at her. I didn't decide to. It happened the way things happen when you don't protect them. You let other things accumulate, and the thing that matters doesn't disappear. It just gets covered, and at some point you can't see it anymore because there's too much between you and it. He paused. That's not an excuse. I know what it cost. She looked at him for a long time. Her hands were wrapped around her mug. Both hands, the way she held things when she was thinking. He had noticed that about her in the first months of their marriage, and had not thought about it in probably 2 years and was thinking about it now. There were times, she said slowly, when I'd be in the penthouse at night and I'd think, if I left tomorrow, would he notice by the end of the week? And I could never answer that with confidence. She looked at the window. The river, probably. If she leaned, she didn't lean. That was the loneliness, not missing you when you were gone, being uncertain whether the missing was mutual. It was, he said. I know that now. She looked back at him. I believed the document, Min Jae. I want you to know that. I believed it completely. Because it fit. Because 3 years of small absences had made a shape, and the document fit that shape, and I stopped questioning it. Seung-ho designed it to fit, Min Jae said. I know. I also know that if the shape hadn't been there... She stopped, started again. A lie needs somewhere to land. He gave me a lie, and it landed in a wound that you made. Both things are true at the same time. He did not argue with this. Because it was accurate, and because arguing with accurate things was one of the habits he was deciding to change. I'm not asking to come back, he said. I need you to know that. I'm not here to ask you to undo what you decided. The papers went through, and that was your decision, and it was a decision you had the right to make. He looked at her. I'm here because I owe you, at minimum, the truth about what happened. And because I want to tell you to your face that the years you spent in that penthouse wondering whether you were loved, you were. Badly and quietly, and with more absence than I had any right to put between us. But you were. The apartment held the silence for a moment. Amara set her mug down. She pressed her palms flat on the counter and looked at the surface of it, the small scratches in the material, the ordinary marks of a life being lived in a space. She breathed once, deliberately. Do you know what the worst part was? She said. Not the loneliness. The self-doubt. Spending 18 months asking myself if I was too sensitive, if I was being unreasonable, if this was just what love looked like when it settled. She looked up. I was an architect with a master's degree who had designed load-bearing structures for buildings that will outlast both of us, and I spent 18 months convinced that the problem was my own perception. I'm sorry, Min Jae said. 2 words. He said them without weight distribution, without management, without the surrounding architecture that people sometimes build around apology to make it easier to deliver. Just the words, placed directly, at the actual cost. She looked at him, and something in her face, not softening, not the cinematic collapse of resistance, just a human thing, small and real, shifted slightly. I know you are, she said. They sat with the tea and the quiet for a while. Neither of them filled it. Min Jae, who had spent 20 years filling silence with decision and direction, let it exist. He found it was not uncomfortable. He found it was actually the first comfortable silence he had sat in for a very long time, which told him something about what had been missing from the spaces he usually occupied. After a while, Amara said, I spoke to my attorney. He waited. The Yongsan project is going well. I have 2 more projects in the pipeline, one in Mapo, one near Itaewon. I'm building something here. She looked at him. On my own. That part is important to me. I understand that, he said. I don't want to go back to the penthouse, she said. I wouldn't ask you to. I don't want to go back to being invisible inside someone else's world. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not saying any of this is possible. I'm not making any decisions today. I'm not asking for decisions today, he said. I'm saying that I haven't stopped. She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly, the micro-expression of someone choosing precision over ease. You were the person who pulled over on the bridge. You were the person who read my paper. Those things are real and I haven't. The divorce papers don't make them not real. No, he said. They don't. She picked up her tea again, looked at the window. What happens to Seung-ho? Federal prosecutors have a cooperation agreement. He'll serve time. The amount depends on how useful his testimony is, which, given how thoroughly he documented everything, should be significant in both directions. He paused. He'll be out in years, not decades. He'll have nothing left when he comes out, financially. He built the exit plan and it didn't exit. Do you hate him? She said. Minji considered this seriously, which was how she had asked it. I don't know, he said after a moment. I know what he cost. I know what it was possible for him to cost, and the fact that it didn't go further. That's not because of him. He was willing for it to go much further. He paused. I think I'm mostly just tired of spending energy in his direction. She nodded slowly. That made sense to her. He could see it. And the syndicate, she said. Restructuring, he said. The federal cooperation requires some changes. Personnel, operations, a few of the structures that Seung-ho built will have to be dissolved permanently because the investigators know too much about them now. He was quiet for a moment. I'm also making changes that the federal agreement doesn't require. She looked at him. Because I've been running something for 20 years and I've been telling myself it had a code, he said. And parts of it did. And parts of it... He stopped. There are things I'm not going to do anymore. That's all I'll say about it. That's more than you've ever said about it, she said. I know. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he understood she was not just hearing the words. She was looking for the thing underneath the words, the structural truth of whether the person saying them was the person capable of meaning them. He let her look. He did not perform steadiness or sincerity. He just sat there, in the small kitchen, with the cut on his hand almost healed and his back still faintly sore from the pallet and the mist-gray Seoul afternoon in the window behind her, and he was exactly who he was. A man with a very long list of things he had done and a shorter list of things he intended to do differently, and no way to prove the second list was real except by the slowest possible method. She seemed to see this. Something in the looking resolved. Come back next Thursday, she said. We can talk more. All right, he said. Not to the penthouse. Here. She looked around her apartment briefly. The drafting table, the sketches, the lamp at its specific angle. On my terms. On your terms, he said. He finished the tea. He stood up and put on his jacket. He looked at her apartment one more time. The small, considered space she had built after leaving him. The life she had assembled in a fourth-floor room with a river view that required a lean. The Yongsan project, he said at the door. The Hanok reconfiguration. She looked at him. I'd like to see it when it's done, if that's something you'd want. She thought about it for a genuine moment. Maybe, she said. He nodded. He went out. The months that followed were not a story of repair in the sense of returning something to its original condition. Amara had been right about that, on the first Thursday, when she had said she was building something. You did not build something that was built before. You built something that knew what the previous thing had cost and incorporated that knowledge into its structure. She worked. She worked hard, and specifically, the way she had always worked, with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they were made for. The Yongsan project finished in March, and the clients cried when they walked through the reconfigured space, which embarrassed her slightly and pleased her deeply. She took on 2 projects in April and a third in May, and by June she had more work than she could comfortably manage alone, and she hired an assistant, a young Korean woman named Park So-yeon, who was 2 years out of architecture school and had the exact combination of technical precision and design instinct that Amara had been looking for without knowing she was looking. She and Minjae met on Thursdays. Not always in her apartment, sometimes in neutral places, coffee shops, the walkway along the Han River that she had discovered in her first month in the Mapo apartment, and that she walked regularly now, in all weather. They talked. They talked about the things that the 3 years of silence had accumulated. Specific days, specific failures of attention, specific moments that had looked one way from the outside and felt entirely different from the inside. These conversations were not comfortable. Comfort was not the goal. The goal was accuracy, building a shared record of what had actually happened, as opposed to the version each of them had constructed alone. He told her about the decisions he was making with the syndicate, not in operational detail. That was not information she needed or wanted, but in terms of principle. The structures Seung-ho had built were dissolved. Several of the operations that had generated the most significant legal exposure were wound down through the federal cooperation process. What remained was leaner and, by the cold logic of criminal enterprise, more sustainable, smaller, less visible, less connected to the kind of ambition that made the whole thing too large to manage with integrity. He did not tell her it was legitimate. It was not fully legitimate, and she knew that, and he did not insult her intelligence by suggesting otherwise. What he told her was that he was making decisions about what he was willing to build and what he was not, and that the line he was drawing was real, even if it was his own line and not one that would satisfy everyone. "I don't need it to satisfy everyone," she said, on one of the Thursday river walks, in a wind that was cold enough that both of them had their hands in their pockets. "I need to understand it, whether your line is real." "How will you know if it is?" he said. "Time," she said. "That's the only way anyone knows if anyone's line is real." He could accept that. He did. The federal case resolved in September, not with a dismissal, but with a negotiated outcome that his attorneys characterized as significantly better than the original exposure. He paid a substantial financial penalty and agreed to a 2-year oversight arrangement on certain financial operations, and the 4 fabricated charges were formally set aside following Seung-ho's testimony and the documentary evidence of the shell company construction. The Busan operation was handled separately, through the information cooperation, and that process was quieter and concluded without any public-facing proceeding. He was not entirely clean. He had never been entirely clean, and this process had not produced that result. What it had produced was an accounting, a specific documented accounting of what had happened and who had been responsible for which parts of it. And that accounting, for all its cost and complexity, felt to him like the most honest thing the organization had produced in years. Seung-ho received a sentence of 6 years, reduced from the potential exposure in exchange for his cooperation. He was held in a facility near Chuncheon. He did not contact Min-jae, and Min-jae did not contact him. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been said in a warehouse that smelled like rust and old water on a gray morning in October. On a Thursday in October, 1 year, almost to the week, from the anniversary dinner that had gone uneaten, Min-jae met Amara on the river walkway at 6 in the evening. The light was the particular amber of Seoul in October, the angle low and specific, the kind of light that makes the ordinary things look like they were deliberately composed. She was already there when he arrived. She was looking at the river with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face turned slightly into the wind coming off the water. She looked like a woman who had made a decision about where she was standing and was not equivocating about it. He stood beside her. They looked at the river together for a while without speaking. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right." "I went back to Atlanta in August," she said, "for 2 weeks. I saw my mother and Danny and I walked around the city I grew up in." She paused. "And I kept thinking, I could stay. I could go back. I could build my practice from there. I have the work. I have the network." He was quiet. He did not tell her what he hoped the end of this was. "And then I got on the plane back to Seoul," she said. "And I landed, and I took the bus from the airport, which I do now because I actually know the route. And I walked to my apartment, and I leaned left at the kitchen window, and I could see the river." She looked at the water. "And I thought, this is mine too. This is mine in a way it wasn't before, because I built it, not because someone installed me in it." "Yes," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "That's what I wanted to tell you." He nodded once. "Not back to the penthouse," she said. "My apartment is mine and it stays mine." "That's not a condition I'm going to argue with," he said. She almost smiled. It was the particular almost smile that he had learned to read over the past year of Thursdays, the one that meant she was considering whether to let the smile fully happen and had decided not to, yet, but was closer than she used to be. I'm not saying everything is repaired," she said.
I know. I'm saying I'm willing to keep building something, whatever the something is. She looked at him. But it has to be built the way I build things, with attention to the actual structure, not just the surface. Tell me what that looks like, he said. Specifically. She looked at him with an expression that said she had not expected him to ask that, or rather, that she had expected him to agree in the general way people agreed to things they intended to adapt later, and his asking for specifics had registered as different from that. It looks like you calling when you say you're going to call, she said. It looks like showing up when you say you're going to show up. Small things, consistent things. She looked at the river. Not grand gestures. I don't need grand gestures. I need you to do the small, boring things reliably, because that's actually what it's made of. I can do that, he said. I know you can, she said. I've been watching you do it for a year. They stood on the river walkway in the October light, and the water moved past below them, indifferent and continuous, doing what rivers do regardless of what happens on their banks. The city behind them went on generating its noise and light and motion. Somewhere above them, a bird moved across the sky without commentating on anything. It was not a perfect moment. Neither of them had gotten here without loss, time, trust, the version of their marriage that had existed before it broke, the version of themselves they might have been if the 3 years had gone differently. Those things were not recovered. They had not been recovered. They had been accounted for and set down in a specific place, and they would remain there, as true things do. What existed instead, on the walkway in the October evening, was something that had been built from the actual materials available. Two people who had both failed and been failed, who had looked at the accurate record of what had happened and decided to keep showing up anyway. Not because it was easy and not because the past was resolved, but because the alternative was to let the damage be the final word, and neither of them was willing to let that be the final word. Minjae looked at the river. He looked at Amara beside him, her profile in the amber light, the pencil that was probably still behind her ear from the day's work, the way she stood with her weight slightly forward like someone who has decided to meet whatever is coming rather than brace against it. He thought about a bridge, years ago. 2 in the morning, cold air, a man pulling over a car because a woman had mentioned offhand that she had never seen the city from above at night. 40 minutes of walking without needing to fill the silence. He had known, then, what he had. He had simply, for a long time, failed to protect it the way it deserved to be protected. He was going to have to do better than knowing. He was going to have to do the small, boring things consistently in the actual texture of real days, without the occasion being large enough to demand his attention. That was the work. Not the dramatic kind. The other kind. The kind that lasted. Next Thursday, he said. Next Thursday, she said. She did not look at him when she said it. She was still looking at the river, but there was a quality to the way she said it, an evenness, a settledness, that he recognized as something rare and not to be wasted. He looked at the river too. The city moved around them. The light went slowly. The water kept going the way water does, without asking anything of anyone, just moving through, carrying what it carries, clean and honest about its direction. They stood there until the light was almost gone.